Hi, everyone. Welcome to Eagles Chat New Mexico. First thing I want to talk about is I'm sure you've all seen the video this week of Jordan Mailata and some of the other Eagles talking about the attitude going into this 2025 season. Um, so let's go ahead and get that up here for everyone and let's take a look. We did last year. And that pretty much sums up the Eagles' attitude going into 2025. I think it's a great attitude. I know pundits have talked about it on multiple other shows, and I think that fits. I think that fits. That's the way the attitude you have to have. Sirianni said, I think it was yesterday about, it's not like when you're a boxer and you're the champ until somebody beats you. The Eagles don't get to sit back and play in the Super Bowl every year until somebody beats them. This is something you have to go out and earn every single year. So I think it's a really, really great attitude. Um, so news, training camp news. Everybody's been covering it on a daily basis. Unfortunately, I don't have that ability right now to do a video every single day, but that's something I can work for. However, there was some big news coming out of the Eagles training camp. Bond's injury. He's out with a back. N'Kobe Dean's yet to practice. They're saying he's still out indefinitely, coming off that injury from last year in the playoffs. And, Nolan Smith, and he's still recovering from his torn triceps in the Super Bowl, but he should be ready to go. But now he's out with a concussion, so there's some things to be concerned about there. Um, it's been pretty hot in Pennsylvania, so there's been a lot of things going on as far as the heat and the players being in pads, and I think that that's probably some of what's going on here. Um, just trying to get back into football shape and dealing with the heat and humidity and everything there. Um, Jordan Mailata actually talked about, Jalen Hunt. He was hoping to have a little bit of a break in practice, but having, went against guys like Fletcher Cox um, and stuff in practice, and now he's got to deal with Jalen Hunt. He was talking about how great Hunt is, and he thinks that him and Nolan are going to be great additions to that defensive line. But I like Vic Fangio. He said he kind of belly laughed when he heard those compliments of those guys. So I think Vic's trying to keep them a little bit humble, but he's also trying to, sort of keep the Eagles focused and moving forward here. Um, Also been hearing that Quinyon Mitchell has looked really, really great. He was interviewed the other day during his post-practice press conference, and somebody asked him about switching sides. He says he hasn't really noticed too much of a difference in the technique, which is good to hear. So hopefully he will be one of those corners that can play shutdown and stay on a receiver, whatever side he goes to. The other cornerback, although I've been hearing Kaylee Ringo has been really, really struggling. Some people are now wondering if he's going to be able to earn a roster spot. So that's something to think about as well. Um, Johan Dotson was interviewed. Dotson was saying that he worked out with Hertz during the off season before practices and between OTAs and everything. So he's looking a lot better. I've heard some really great things about Marshall, looking really good in practice, and a couple of the other young receivers that have kind of bounced around the league, but are looking good as possible candidates for the Eagles as number 4, number 5. Um, so that's really, really great. And the other thing is, I hear Shipley's been taking second team reps. Um, a little bit of stealing some reps from Dylan. So that's kind of good news because, like I've talked about on here before, I'm a big Shipley fan. So I'm kind of looking forward to being able to see what he can do this year with Saquon. Um, And speaking of Hurts, everybody's talked about how great he's looked. He's been throwing a lot of deep balls, more so than before. He's also thrown a couple picks in practice, which that's to be expected. He's trying to push the envelope, um, to quote Phil Simms. I know he's not very popular for ranking Hurts down at number 9, but that's one of the things I have heard. But Kevin Patullo was interviewed by John Clarke on his show, and he was talking about how Goddard was saying the transition to the new OC has been a lot easier than in years past. So hopefully that bodes well for the Birds offense moving forward. The other thing is Patullo has talked about Hurts and his leadership, and Hurts has looked really good, just being more vocal, getting on guys when they're making mistakes. So you're starting to hear some of those Tom Brady-esque um, leadership qualities coming out, in Hurts. And I think some of that is, he has talked to some of these guys during the offseason, was like, hey, how did you repeat? How were you able to come back and keep winning? And I think this is probably stemming from some of the advice that they were giving. I heard he's been a lot more emotional. He's been a lot more outgoing with some of the other guys. So that's kind of really good. Um, but Patullo was also saying, along with being more vocal, Hurts has a better command of the offense. He thinks a better command of the offense than what he had last year. And part of that is their relationship. They've been together for a long time. He said, they text each other ideas, and, Hertz will get on him if he feels that something's uncomfortable, and vice versa. So I'd strongly encourage you, go over to NBC Philly and Philly Sports and check out John Clarke's interview, to get all the details. Um, but somebody asked him, what are you guys going to do? Is it going to be, John Clarke said to him, are you going to be able to do the same things you did last year? Is it going to be primary run? Is it going to be primary pass? He said, and basically the Eagle attitude from last year. Hey, if we need to run, we'll run. If we need to pass, we'll pass. We'll take it week to week, game to game, situation to situation. When asked about AJ and Devonta, he, spoke volumes about how great they were. He calls AJ Brown the best receiver in the league. I don't think you're going to get any argument from Eagles fans about that. Um, he was saying, they're still, it's iron sharpening iron. They're pushing each other in practice. They both want gold jackets someday. Devonta Smith wants to be first team All Pro, is one of the stories coming out of camp as well. So they're really pushing each other to be the best, and really pushing each other, um, going forward. Um, as far as any other things on the defense, going back to the defensive side of the ball, it was nice to have Makuba sign, but now he's out. Um, but it didn't sound like it was anything major. It's going to be just a little bit of time there. Um, but it does sound like he may be back there starting at safety and along with DeJean at some time. So that's going to be interesting if the Eagles go too high on the safeties, that DeJean may be back there along with Blankenship. Um, Another little story that came up is ESPN ranks the Eagles as second best roster in the NFL after the Ravens, Lions, and after the Ravens, and then before the Lions and Bills. Um, I think when you're looking at teams that are that exceptional, it's really easy to put one and say, "Oh yeah, it's always going to." Every year, everybody says the Ravens have the best roster, best coaching staff, best quarterback, all this stuff. And where do we find them? Knocked out in the first round of the playoffs, or losing a championship game when the offense can't get out of its own way, a couple seasons ago. So they may have the best roster, but I'm not so sure they have the best team. Um, and there is some things to that. You see it in the NCAA tournament basketball every year. They're always like, "Oh, this school upset this other one." Well, one school may have five-star recruits, but they can't play together as a team. The Ravens play together great as a team, but there's just something that happens to that team when they get to the playoffs. So there's something missing there, an extra cog, an extra piece of motivation, um, attitude, you know. So who knows? That's kind of going there. So let's look at weeks 4 to 6 of the schedule, coming up after, in week 4, the Eagles will play their nemesis, the Buccaneers. Why can't they ever get the Buccaneers in Philly? It seems like they're always playing them in Tampa, always playing them in the beginning, early fall, when it's still hot as blue blazes down there in Florida. Um, so I think some of that plays a role in it as well. But I mean, I think that could be very much be a playoff preview. Could even be an NFC Championship preview. I think the Bucks have done enough to improve. A lot of it's still on Baker Mayfield. Everybody's got him in the top 10 already as a quarterback. After one really good season. Um, but he has a lot of talent. I will give him that. So we'll have to see, and we'll have to go from there. But I think the Eagle offense is they match up. It's a bad matchup, I think, sometimes with the Buccaneers. And I think, Todd Bowles sort of knows that. He was a defensive coordinator for years. He's still coordinating that defense, even though he's the head coach. So I really think that this is going to be a little bit of a struggle, but I see the Eagles winning a close one there. Um, something like 20-17 or 21-24, somewhere in that range. I don't see that being a high scoring game at all. I think the Bucks defense just matches up really well with the Eagle offense. Broncos, and that game's in Philly. I really think that that's a win for the Eagles. I think that Vic's going to come up with something that keeps Bo Nix confused, kind of on edge. We saw what Buffalo was able to do to the Broncos offense, by pressuring Nix in the playoffs. Yeah, he'll have a little more of a season under his belt, but I think that that's an end there. And then the first game at the Meadowlands with the Giants, and I think that that's an Eagle win. I think the Giants are improved, but I think that that's still an Eagle win. I think they win kind of going away there. I'd also look for Barkley to have a you know, pretty good game. Um, Big fan of Abdul Carter, as a Penn State fan. But I really think that, it's that defense might be a little better than I'm expecting, but I still expect the Eagles to kind of win that one going away. Lastly, here on Eagles Chat is I saw a great article by Ruben Frank. He talked about um, and he printed in Sports Philadelphia about possible Hall of Famers on the Eagles. Yeah, it was really bizarre. I hadn't thought about it, but he talked about there's been like 4 Eagle Hall of Famers in the last like 10 years. And there hadn't been any for 50 years before that. So that was kind of there were some really bad teams in the 60s and 70s, and then we got in the 80s, but he mentioned, some really great players that when he showed their stats, it was really, they really deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Um, he talked about some past Eagles and, Barkley as a current Eagle. Um, but, I've added a few to this list. We talked about Saquon, 2,000 yards. You're pretty much going to get yourself in if you stay healthy. Fletcher Cox had some really great numbers, a number of Pro Bowls. Um, Cunningham is the one that I don't see happening. He was sort of that first Weapon X sort of approach to the quarterback position. But he also kind of bounced around team to team to team. And I think that that's one of the things, after he left the Eagles that will hurt him in the long run, even though he's got a great record as a starting quarterback, better than Eli Manning. And everybody wants Eli already in because he won 2 Super Bowls. That may be one of the things that keeps Cunningham out. Again, I'm going off of what Rube said, plus, my own interpretation here. So Ertz, didn't realize Ertz had that great of numbers. Till you look back, that was kind of interesting. I still don't see him as a Hall of Famer. He's never really been a game changer. He has the numbers to put himself there. But he's never been the guy that we think about with like a Travis Kelce or an Antonio Gates or um, you know, Gonzalez, things like that. So I don't see him ever getting there. Deshaun Jackson, great player, has the NFL record for the most, great. I think it was greater than 60-yard touchdown receptions. Um, However, again, that team to team to team, no championships, I think is going to be what keeps him out. Malcolm Jenkins, um, I think he would still go in as a Saint. I don't see him going in as an Eagle. He went back, played for the Saints one more time, before retiring. Um, but I don't. Again, he's another one of those guys, great leader on defense. He's not going to have the stats that those Hall of Fame voters look for. And I always think that that's a shame. I think that's a shame. Lane Johnson should be first ballot. Seth Joyner was one that he brought up, and when you look at Seth's numbers, oh my God, it's like, why wasn't he in the Hall of Fame already? So he's one that I think, Rube hit the nail on the head there. He's a guy who's deserved it for a very, very long time. Hopefully, the Veterans Committee kind of gets themselves together and says, hey, this guy really deserves to be in there. Let's get him in. Jason Kelsey, of course, he'll be there. Shady, oh my God, with his numbers, I think that had he had it, he's got a couple Super Bowls, but as a backup running back. But I still think that with his numbers and when you see where he compares to people from his era, when you see where he compares all time, Shady should definitely be in. Shady should be in the Hall of Fame. Um, Donovan, Donovan's one of those guys. I think he peaked for a very short period of time, and it was that run of Eagles NFC Championship games. I think even if he lost another Super Bowl or two, but I think having gotten to another Super Bowl or two would have made a difference there. And I think people would put him in that breath of, hey, he was a great quarterback. But then he had teetered off towards the latter part of his career. He kind of fell off the cliff like some veteran players do. So he's one that could be up there. JP, thank God he finally retired. You can see that at the end of his career, he was definitely had fallen off from that dominant tackle he had been for eons. And I really, really think that he's a guy that now he has retired when it comes around, first ballot Hall of Famer. Another current Eagle who's a first ballot, I think right now, continuing his, if his career goes well, is AJ Brown. Definitely going to have the numbers. He's always going to outshine Devonta a little bit. I've seen the interview where Devonta Smith said, with Shannon Sharp, he said he was going after a gold jacket. And I think I made the comment in the video last week. I think he needs to move on to somewhere else where he would be the featured number one, unless he has multiple Super Bowl wins with the Eagles. He's already got 2 appearances, and I think it's possible, but right now I'm not seeing, especially with him only having 900 yards last year. I don't see that as a big, strong possibility for him. Hurts, maybe. But again, it's going to be overcoming that bias that people seem to have against him because he's a quarterback of pretty much a running team right now. And all he cares about is championships. Although he gets another Super Bowl win, the Birds get another win, you could make the argument that he's had a better career than Eli Manning. That's my thought. So those are things that I think about. And then, the Eagles' offensive line, we could also say Mailata is on that trajectory. Defensive line, some people already have Carter heading in that direction. We'll have to see what happens with Davis with his big weight loss. I still think Jordan Davis was having a good year, in spite of what people thought, because again, we are a numbers fantasy league driven fan base, Hall of Fame base, media base, and Jordan Davis is asked to take up space, occupy 2-3 blockers, and that's his job. But I think, we're going to see him get a little more pressure on the quarterback, things like that, because I think he'll be a little bit quicker. Zach Vaughn, who knows where his career trajectory is going. And, Quinyon Mitchell and DeJean, the way they played as rookies, if they have 10 years of that in them, we'll have to see. We'll have to see where they end up. So there's a lot of potential in this current Eagles team. Um, you know, I guess I'll finish up with talking about Goddard. I don't see it just with his injury history. It's kept his numbers pretty low, but he's a pretty dangerous weapon when he does um, get out there and get out in front of things. So when he's healthy. So that we'll kind of leave the Hall of Fame talk there. Again, still waiting on that list for my son of his top Eagles of all time. Um, from what I understand, he's almost done. He's almost forgotten about a couple people. We've had some discussions, and he's trying to get that list up and running. But here pretty soon we'll get him on here and we'll have that discussion about that. Maybe we'll do that as a live stream. So you all have a great day, and that's it for Eagles Chat.